Good evening. This is All Sports with LD coming back at you with another YouTube post from our YouTube channel. Before I get into tonight's content, please like, subscribe, and comment. Also share. So, it was 22 years ago today, April 29th, Lennox Lewis squared off against 6'7" Michael Grant. And I remember when this fight was announced, or leading up to it. I remember the hoopla surrounding Michael Grant. Up until the actual fight, I had watched many of Michael Grant's fights. And one thing that was clear, he was not ready to face Lennox Lewis. But I understand in the sport of boxing, this was an opportunity for him to make quite a bit of money, also grab headlines, and the managers and promoters get opportunity to make a lot of money off of Michael Grant. And when one looks at his background, clearly you can see he wasn't prepared for this. With only having 12 amateur fights, and up to the point where he faced Lennox Lewis, he was 31-0. But he mainly feasted upon marshmallows to get a shot at the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. And as to the build up to the fight, there was also a bit of a controversy surrounding this fight, specifically with Lennox Lewis' WBA belt. It says here, after Lewis defeated Holyfield, the WBA ordered Lewis to defend the title against John Ruiz of Chelsea, Massachusetts, who was then an obscure Don King fighter who had been made the WBA's #1 ranked contender. The WBA gave permission for Lewis to fight his WBC mandatory Michael Grant first if he would fight Ruiz next, to which Lewis agreed. Opposed to this, King challenged this decision in court and on the basis of a clause in the Lewis-Holyfield rematch contract that said Lewis' first bout as undisputed champion would be against the WBA's #1 contender. Lewis was therefore to be stripped of his WBA belt if he fought Grant first. It was because of this that the WBA instated its super champion title, giving ununified title holders who also hold a WBA belt more time to defend against mandatory challengers. Well, that's what it says, but there's clearly a move by these, sanctioning bodies to make more money off of fighters and stealing them with these bogus super champion titles. But we'll move on from that. So, getting back to this. And I had no problem with Lennox Lewis saying, I'm not going to fight John Ruiz. Because, again, at that point, no one had really heard of John Ruiz. He's a Don King fighter. John Ruiz benefited by being one of Don King's many fighters. So they pushed him to the WBA #1 contender. Lennox, on the other hand, recognized as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world and undisputed ring heavyweight champion of the world. So for him, it didn't really matter. He's still recognized as undisputed champ. So he said, "No, I'm not fighting John Ruiz. There's no benefit to me." And the thing about Lennox is one of those champions who says, "Listen, I'll fight the toughest guy out there that you guys, the media, boxing journalists, etc., says is the toughest fight out there," which was Michael Grant. And I remember at the time, the media upselling this fight as if Michael Grant was a serious threat to Lennox Lewis. albeit guy was 6'7". This is a big heavyweight. But the problem was he was inexperienced. He was amateurish in his technique. Clearly, previous fights that he's had, they like I said, they were pretty much marshmallows they fought. Pretty easy pickings. Probably the closest he came to one of the toughest fights, at closest he can get before the Lennox Lewis fight. He fought Andrew Golota. Well, and if you look back, if you remember back on that, Andrew Golota was really on the back end of his career, so he really wasn't. That's really the toughest, fighter on his ledger, being Michael Grant. So at that time, that legitimized Michael Grant's vying for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. But in my eyes, again, I always felt that he was rushed along. He didn't develop properly. Wasn't a very skilled big man. 6'7", and the physique he had. He looked like he could throw some punches, but he was very awkward. I remember watching that Andrew Golota fight. Yeah, he took Golota out, but it was a very awkward fighter. And I was like, oh yeah, Lennox is going to eat him up. And sure enough, Lennox dispatched him in 2 rounds. Probably one of Lennox's easiest fights that he's ever had. But you can't fault Lennox, because again, he took on the guy that everybody said was a threat to his legacy or heavyweight championship. So he said, okay, I'll call you guys his bluff. He obliterates the guy in 2 rounds, and then all of a sudden, it's like, well, he really wasn't experienced anyway. See, the media they're very fickle. 1 minute a guy is a threat, the next minute, so when the guy gets beat, he really wasn't much of a threat, etc., etc. But they do this a lot, and I just remember that. Going back to that fight, remembering that this is the approach that the media took on this fight. That any person with some boxing knowledge should have known that this was going to be an easy fight for Lennox. Michael Grant, again, with 12 fights, amateurs, and 31 fights in the pros, mainly against soft opposition, didn't prepare him for the likes of Lennox Lewis, a future Hall of Famer. So it was an exciting fight in this sense. You were just waiting for Lennox to knock him out, and because you knew it was coming. It wasn't, at least for me, and as I'm watching the fight, I'm just waiting for Lennox to pull the trigger or whatever he's going to do to put this guy out. Because, like I said, in my mind, this guy has no business in the ring with Lennox Lewis. And sure enough, if I remember correctly, he puts him down in the first round, and then finish Michael Grant off in the second round with a vicious uppercut. And that was it. It was a nice payday for Lennox. But the fans didn't get their money's worth, and they really should have known they weren't going to get their money's worth, because again, it's like putting a lamb in there with a lion. And I'm not sure what people really expected or really believed, that Michael Grant could defeat Lennox Lewis. It was preposterous, and I just remember all the hoopla surrounding the fight, and this sort of complaining from John Ruiz. Now, to his credit, he did go on to win the WBA version of the heavyweight title. I don't recall who he fought, but he became heavyweight champion of the world. But I mean, really, if your legacy as the heavyweight champion of the world and you get beat by really a really, Roy Jones started his career off, I think, as a junior middleweight. So your legacy is that you got beat really by a junior middleweight for the heavyweight title. That's another story for another day. But, you get my point. And you almost feel sorry for John Ruiz, albeit he did win the title. But I think in a lot of ways he was set up to fail because, there's just no way. And when you look back over Ruiz's career, there's just no way that you can really justify putting him at the number one contender position. But again, being a Don King fighter, that's the benefit of being with a promoter like Don King. He can get you to the title whether you deserve it or not. But anyway, it's just my little spill on a fight that happened 22 years ago today. And it's just one more peg in the Hall of Fame career of Lennox Lewis. Unfortunately for Michael Grant, afterwards, his career hit a steep decline. And it was bound to happen because, again, if you put someone in there after 12 amateur fights, only 31 fights, mainly against soft opposition, and you lose the biggest fight in the biggest stage in the world, and it's kind of downhill from there because he really never progressed in terms of skill level. I believe at one point, if I remember, he was on the shelf for a number of months because he suffered some injuries. And his career ended basically kind of like one of those, if I remember correctly, it's kind of like maybe the off TV sort of fights, kind of the he kind of just went to the background, and finally he ended his career. That was really the highlight of Michael Grant's career, fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world and getting knocked out in 2 rounds. That's the legacy of Michael Grant. And unfortunately, like I said, I believed his managers, trainers, and promoters moved him along too fast. That was too soon for that magnitude of a fight. So that's my 2 bits for now. Have a good one.